So we are now live. Welcome to our webinar, Border Carbon Adjustment in the EU, the launch of the sectoral report called a sectoral deep dive. My name is Andre Barcu. I'm the director of the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition. I welcome you. If this is the webinar you intend to attend, then you're in the right place. We will give our participants a few minutes to stream in, and then in about 3-4 minutes we will start. So bear with us for a few minutes until we get kind of a bit of a critical mass and we can start. I think that somebody should make a suggestion to Zoom that they should have a process whereby they can start accepting people in while you don't have to have everybody on the screen. So that makes a little bit awkward for everybody kind of being silent, but we'll have to bear with it. There. So our speaker is here. Monsieur Michel, can you hear me?
Yes.
I
hear you very well. Sorry for being late. I was outside. I had to come back to the ministry.
As they say in Quebec, vous êtes les bienvenus. So, do you know everyone? We are now in the process of admitting people, as I mentioned to some of your colleagues. We are waiting for people to sign in. There's supposed to be over 400 people, so it takes a few minutes for people to stream in. And I said that we will give it about until 14:30, 3:34, and give people a chance to stream in. After which we will get started. So just bear with me for a few minutes, please. Very well. I think that it's time to start. As people are in these days, everybody is on a very tight schedule, jumping from one video conference to another. So welcome to everyone to this webinar today on the border carbon adjustment in the EU. This is the launch of the sectoral report, called it Sectoral Deep Dive for a better name of it. My name is Andre Barcu. I'm the director of the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition, which is a long name, but bear with us. Today, we are here to launch the work that we are doing in the context of a bigger program that the European Roundtable is doing on CBAM. It's a program that started about over a year ago with the first report where we unpacked what the CBAM, the components of the CBAM, and also discuss the different criteria for judging the options that or each of these dimensions. This report was issued on September of last year. I think it was relatively generally well received, and many of you may have seen it or have heard about it. As a result of that, we continued the project with a broader scope of support from many countries and as well as companies, associations. So it's quite a broad support for it, and we hope it's balanced. Now, that second part has a number of components, and the first component that the people that were interested to support us and what we heard in our discussion was a discussion around sectoral deep dive. How would the sector impact the choices that we have to make in a CBAM design? The second part of this will be another release that we will do within a month or so, but we'll discuss that a bit later. So we have, this report is now available on the ERCST website, and we are very pleased and proud to have today a number of quite eminent speakers that can give us their views on the CBAM, on the debate of CBAM, also on the report itself. We have Ms. Karin Karlsbro, who is a member of Parliament for Sweden from the Renew Europe group, as well as Monsieur Laurent Michel, who is the Director of Energy and Climate at the French Ministry of Ecological Transition. So they will open with a keynote speech giving us their views. There will be then a presentation of the report that Michael Melling, Aaron Cosby, and myself, were the authors of this report, will undertake. And we'll have a reaction to our report from Jacob Hansen, the head of Fertilizers Europe, Neil Lawler from DG Trade, Susanne Droge, who is well known to all of you from SWP, has written substantively and extensively on CBAMs and trade, Joachim Hein from the German Business Federation, BDI, and last but not least, Richard Baron, old friend, who is now with ECF, but we all know him, IEA, OECD, and many other impersonations. Welcome, Richard, good to see you. So first, Ms. Karlsbro, you have the microphone. I can't say you have the floor, you have the microphone.
So thank you very much. I would like to welcome you to the European Parliament. Nowadays it's quite closed and it's difficult to enter the building, but I wanted to take you with me here today. And thank you so much for having the opportunity to be with you. As already said, my name is Karin Karlsbro. I'm a member of the European Parliament representing the Renew group, and I'm from Sweden. And as mentioned, I was the rapporteur in the Committee on International Trade on the report towards a WTO-compatible carbon border adjustment mechanism, as we voted on last week in the Parliament as a part of the bigger report from the ENVI Committee. When we start to work with the report in Intercommittee, we asked ourselves two basic questions, actually. Is a carbon border adjustment mechanism possible, and is it affordable? But first of all, I would like to remind us why we discuss this. We are, as we all know, facing an alarming global climate crisis, and there is no time to lose. Scientists, economists argue that global pricing of carbon dioxide would be one of the most important, or the most important, efficient way for lowering the emissions. But it's obvious, for obvious reasons, not politically possible to have a global pricing on carbon dioxide like that. So we need to find other ways forward. In the European Union, we already, as we know, we have systems internally for pricing carbon emissions. And on top of that, we have a number of legislative measures in place to address climate change. And we want to achieve more. However, many of our trading partners still lack any form of carbon pricing, either through a carbon tax or through an ETS. Indeed, some of them do not share the same ambition on climate policy as the EU. But when third countries do not apply with similar measure, it can lead to what is known as carbon leakage. This means, as we know, that the production moves outside of the EU because costs are too high and regulation is too cumbersome. And such a leakage undermines our efforts to lower global our climate emissions, and that's why we have to see this from a global perspective. So therefore, it's important that the EU create a price on emissions also on important goods, I think. The polluter pays principle is a base for environmental politics, not only in the EU. So we have to try to keep that principle up in different ways and find the right methods. We simply need to pay for all emissions, no matter where the emission occurs. That sounds quite simple, but in practice, it's quite difficult, as you know. For a carbon border adjustment mechanism to work, it has to be straight out a climate action. The mechanism has to be compatible, totally in line with international rules for trade with the WTO, and also in line with our existing trade and investment agreements. At the same time, it has to create an incentive for producers, both within and outside European Union, to readjust their production and for countries to price their emissions. And very important, no emissions should be double priced and no production should be protected twice. So that was principle for our report and discussion in INTA. And it's also very important to say that we do not want to punish anyone, not punish our trading partners. We want to lower, we want to reach the carbon emissions, not our partners. And we don't do this towards anyone. We want to create this system together with our partners. And the best would be if we could cooperate globally. And of course, in this house, there are lots of expectations to the new administration in the US on this. A frequently asked question is, what will happen with the revenues? And the best, if of course, that our trading partners also put a price on carbon dioxide, so we don't have any incomes from this, but we're not there. So from a trade and from a WTO perspective, we would be very comfortable if the money from the fees goes directly to climate actions, mostly in poor countries. That would be a comfortable way to not because it may risk to see that this is just a way to finance our own economy and our get resources to our own budget, and that's something we have to be aware of. The time where we go on with trade as usual has passed. I think the climate needs to be saved and trade has to become more sustainable. Without ever stopping to fight for an open international trade and a free market, a price on imported emissions will be, I think, the key to lowering emissions and making trade more sustainable. We have to do both the things at the same time. And European Union can't wait. We have to make the polluter pay no matter where the emissions occur, as I said. The question is, as I started with, is a CBAM appropriate and possible from a political, from a legal, from a trade, from a climate perspective? And our conclusion from the INTA, International Trade Committee's perspective, was yes, it is, but it has to be in line with the trade rules, and it must be for one purpose, to cut carbon emissions. That's important, because otherwise there will not be a possibility for a CBAM. If it's designed in the right way, it can be an efficient instrument, not just an example of green protectionism. So that was a short summary of the discussion and the conclusions in our report. And thank you so much for the possibility to share this with you today.
Ms. Carlsborough, thank you very much for taking the time and joining us today and giving us a bit of the flavor of what went on. I think that it's quite fascinating that the CBAM is already attained the political debate very early on. We were discussing, the various pieces of the Green Deal and which one are a political, which are a technical level. But it's quite clear that we are now in a very heated debate, and it's going to be an important piece. And again, thank you very much. Monsieur Michel, may I ask you now for your intervention, please?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, thank you very much. And can you see me also? So I'm very happy to give you some introduction words and to attend this meeting, because this is a very important topic for the success of the European Green Deal. France has supported the work of ERCST on CBAM from the beginning, and we had already a very good impact on the first report. And we think CBAM is an essential element of the European Green Deal. It's a high priority for France, and we've been supporting this measure for many years. And that's why we are glad to see it now in the center of the Fit for 55 package. And we'll hope as a presidency council in the first semester 2022 that we will be able to advance and strive with other European countries to conclude the negotiation on this topic. Just to say what is not CBAM, it's not green protectionism. It's an environmental issue. It allows to increase our climate ambition with better avoiding carbon leakage. It's not protectionism, it's an environmental measure. But of course, it's not a miracle. We do not see CBAM as a silver bullet. We see it as a key component of a comprehensive policy package to facilitate the transition of industry to climate neutrality. And that's why we think we need to have a robust CBAM to be able to attend all these goals and to be, of course, very compatible with WTO rules. We need to have a robust measure with a progressive implementation, with perhaps some pilot sectors, and also the question of having some transition with the free allowance allocation system after a transition period. That's why we need to give a clear vision of this mechanism while being pragmatic to implement it quickly with pilot sectors and a transition period to phase out free allocation. This transition will probably help us to adjust the mechanism to the impact on the European and third country producers. It's just only some highlights, of course, of what all has to be addressed in this important question. And we think our position is similar in many aspects to the recent European Parliament resolution that will help the Commission to prepare its proposal. So to conclude, I would like to thank again the ERCST for this work that will contribute to advance the discussion of this important topic. And I also would like to use this opportunity of this webinar to inform, if necessary, all the participants that France will host next week on March 23rd, a high-level web conference in order to give a political momentum to the topic and share our intentions with our international partners, so that we view CBAM as an instrument to strengthen global climate action in the spirit of Paris Agreement. Thank you very much again for this webinar, for all the report and all what will be delivered. As we are now discussing our climate law in Parliament, I will not be able to attend this meeting, but my colleague Frédéric Branger, which follows all these works, also will attend the webinar. Thank you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monsieur Michel. Appreciate your participation. We know everybody is very busy. I understand it's a very busy political agenda at this point. And we also thank La France for the support in this project and in other areas that we cooperate with France as ERCST. With this, what I would like to now move on and start with the presentation of the report. So, Darek, if you want to put the presentation on the screen and start with the introduction. So you will see a bit of a, how should I put it, a bit of a ballet here with people with kind of sharing part of the presentation among ourselves. So Darek will start, will then go to Aaron, Michael, and then myself. So Darek, would you start, please?
Yes, thank you, Andre. So the report we're presenting today basically is part of the CBAM project we started more than a year ago, and this is first of the reports of the series of reports in this part of the report. As you can see, we continue with the graphic layer, and the report at the moment is structured into 4 main more chapters, include adding the introduction and the conclusions to that. So what we just to recall, preparing in this part of the project is 4 reports. The first one we're presenting today. The second report will be published later in April, covering the CBAM proposal from our side. The third report we're planning is after the Commission will publish the proposal. And then the fourth report should be a proposal for a framework and pathway for introducing different policy measures to address carbon leakage and competitiveness. In this report, the background is that this is the deep dive on what the CBAM would mean for individual sectors. It seeks to address the impact and sustainability of the likely design of the CBAM on individual sectors, and it lays the foundation for the subsequent report. The report covers following sectors. This is cement, chemicals, electricity, ferrous metals, fertilizers, non-ferrous metals, pulp and paper, and also the refined petroleum products. What is important preparing this report, we conducted a series of structured interviews and also consultations with sectoral associations and other stakeholders in the topic. So this was preparation for the report, and then it was further research and data analysis on our part. The structure of the report is firstly the sectoral profiles. So this is the deep dive where we cover the market structure and environmental considerations, what are the trade patterns, and finally, what are the implications for the BCA design. This is the first part. Then into the second part, we go to the cross-cutting analysis. And this is sectoral profiles in deep, including the linkages and outlining a number of patterns across the sectors. So this is the analytical part. And thirdly, this is covering the conclusions, which we present also in this presentation.
I think that we pass it on to Aaron. Aaron?
Thanks very much. So as Andrea and Darek have both said, this is a deep dive. The idea is to get into the details of the sectoral characteristics of the 8 different sectors that we look at and try to understand for each of them what those different characteristics mean in the way of an ideal CBAM design. And of course, I think you can predict from the outset that the differences between the sectors will militate for different sorts of CBAM design in different directions. So I'm going to just lay out the framework that guided us in this research of linkages between sectoral characteristics.
I need to move this from this screen over to this screen. Can you move this over there?
Yes, I can.
I would suggest that people mute themselves, please. Can we mute ourselves, please? Thank you.
Good. I won't mute myself. I'll just kidding. So the idea is that there are a set of market characteristics of the sectors, and each of the different types of characteristics have linkages to potential CBAM designs. using the framework that we laid out in our first report of different design elements of a possible CBAM. So I'm going to lay out that framework for you. We started with a framework of possible understandings. That framework evolved and was enriched by our research as we went on. And this is the final framework of linkages. I'll present it in three parts, the three sort of themes by which we grouped the characteristics sectorally. And Derek had laid them out before. They are first market structure, and this includes the product types, the industrial organization, the investment prospects. The second is environmental considerations, and here we looked at emissions intensity, low carbon pathways, the prospects for resource shuffling, and finally trade patterns, and this includes the different trade flows, imports and exports, the trading arrangements in particular to each sector, and the key trading partners. So starting with market structure and dynamics. Those sectors with long and complex downstream value chains, think about those sectors like chemicals and steel, where the final traded product is not a chemical or a ton of steel. It is in fact steel pipes, it is plastics, it is household goods. Those sectors, that particular structure, sectoral structure, argues for a coverage of a CBAM that extends beyond the upstream basic production and down into the processed goods production. Even though all of pretty much the emissions take place in the upstream, if you don't cover those downstream producers, they will receive the costs passed through from the upstream, but not be protected in the same way from leakage and competitiveness impacts that the upstream is. So you simply pass the risk along to the downstream sectors in those sectors. Those types of sectors also argue for a coverage of a CBAM that are a scope for coverage that may include the emissions embodied in the input goods received from upstream. That's a scope 3 emission. Again, because otherwise you're simply passing the risk of leakage and competitiveness impacts along to the downstream sectors. The second point under market structure is that those sectors that have close substitutes, Laurent Michel mentioned that we may be talking about a pilot phase. If there are close substitutes from one sector to another, it doesn't make sense or we need to be conscious of the dynamics. If we include one sector in the pilot phase and not another sector which may be in the pilot phase. And we may be creating incentives for basic material substitution that we don't actually want. The third element under market structure is that some of these sectors, well, in fact, most of these sectors have pressing needs for major capital investments. We're talking about hundreds of billions of euros of investments over the next decade, waiting to be made. In those sectors, the argument is those that have the most pressing needs are probably not candidates for a pilot phase, or at a minimum, those sectors, if not included in a pilot phase, need to understand what the long-term prospects for their inclusion and under what terms look like under a CBAM, because otherwise we have either deferred capital investment or investment completely outside of Europe, or investment going into greenhouse gas intensive capital stock that locks in that sort of a GHG intensive footprint. Derek, if we could go to the next slide. Environmental considerations. Those sectors whose trading partners have lower emissions intensity, that is the global trading partners who have lower emissions intensity, will lose competitiveness and will experience, will lose competitiveness to their global competitors if the CBAM allows those global competitors to challenge whatever default benchmark is put in place. This is a natural outcome of that resource feature. The other potential, if we allow a challenging of whatever benchmark is put in place, whatever default, is for resource shuffling from those countries. And I wish we had time to dive into what exactly resource shuffling is, but basically it's a reorganization of trade without a reorganization of production patterns that sees low GHG goods coming to Europe that were already being produced. those sectors within the EU that have a large spread between clean plants and dirty plants, a great heterogeneity of production methods, are probably at risk of seeing some of those dirty plants basically closed down as a result of carbon pricing, and a CBAM will not be able to protect them. This is a simple matter of the changing nature of competitiveness. But in those cases, the dynamic will not be a result of CBAM design. The argument then against allowing challenges to default is not as strong in sectors like that. Some sectors have a huge amount of indirect emissions, that is, emissions from the electricity that they consume, well, the scope 2 indirect emissions. Those sectors will not be well protected by a CBAM that doesn't somehow account for those costs. So a CBAM that just accounts for direct costs will not offer protection against leakage, will not offer a protection against competitiveness impacts. And that is a particularly acute problem for sectors with high amounts of indirect emissions. So that argues for a CBAM that covers those scope 2 emissions. Beyond that, there are indirect carbon costs. This is another question that we dive into in some detail in the report. I won't go into it at this point. Finally, sectors with low carbon pathways that have high cost implications. Think of those sectors where innovation is on the horizon, but there's a huge cost margin differential between conventional production and the clean production that we want to incentivize. May be to some extent protected against leakage and competitiveness impact by a CBAM, but if those costs are high enough, really you're talking about a need for some sort of complementary instrument. The CBAM itself may be protective, but it will not allow the conditions for investment that we need to get to net zero by 2050. The final slide in this suite then looks at trade patterns. Those sectors that have a significant share of exports, this is a rather obvious one, sectors that have a rather significant share of exports in their profiles argue for a CBAM which covers not only imports, that is adjusts not just for imports coming into the EU, but also covers exports. That is, somehow relieves exports of the pain of carbon pricing at the point of departure from the EU. Or if that's deemed legally impossible, then we need some sort of complementary instruments to protect the competitiveness of those producers in foreign markets. And finally, those sectors that have trade patterns that involve specific hubs in countries with poor governance records argue for a CBAM that has very strong prevention against transshipment. The idea that the goods would simply be shipped from a country that is particularly dirty through a country that's particularly clean and end up in Europe. This is only an issue if we are looking at country-based exemptions, but it is a key concern. This wraps up the list of key linkages, and I think we're going to see them demonstrated in some detail as we dive into the report. But just to give you a snapshot of what the report looks like, we dive, as Andre and Darek said, into each of the 8 different candidate sectors, looking at the 3 themes, the market structure, the environmental considerations, the trade patterns, and then thinking for each about what the implications are for BCA. This is a snapshot of the beginning summary in each of those sectors. It's a standardized table that looks just at some of the key statistics that the sector has, and so a brief summary of some of the highlight characteristics of the sector. Of course, this is followed by rather in-depth analysis, textual analysis, grouped along those 4 subjects: market characteristics, environmental, trade, and implications for a CBAM. I'll pass it along now to my friend and colleague, Michael Melling, to talk about what kind of yields we get from the analysis.
Right. Mike, thank you, Aaron. Yes, taking it from there, what Aaron just described is really the bulk of the report. So the 50 pages give and take of sectoral deep dive analysis of the 8 sectors that we looked at. But Darek mentioned already, unfortunately, we cannot obviously represent the rich wealth of insights that we gained. It was really useful, I think, for all of us writing this to go that deep into individual sectors. But Darek already mentioned initially that what we tried to take away from this is sort of a number of cross-cutting patterns. And that's what I'm going to summarize here. This is sort of the third and most analytical part, I would say, of the report. And there's 4 categories, essentially, of these cross-cutting patterns. Some insights, some tendencies or trends or patterns we found that affect pretty much all sectors, some that affect the majority of sectors, only excluding 1 or 2, some that affect a number of sectors, but no longer a majority, and finally, some issues that are really specific to individual sectors. And let me start with the observations that really are relevant for all sectors, as we found. We were struck looking at the data, but also speaking with representatives from the sectors, that competition, the competitive landscape has really changed dynamically in recent years. And this is not just something that we heard from the sectors, very emphatically, but we could also see it in the data. For instance, production capacity in a number of sectors has increased dramatically abroad. In many cases, imports have also increased quite dramatically in recent years. In some cases, this is also, one can clearly surmise there's a link between strategic behavior, strategic support for certain industries as reflected in government plans to increase capacity, production capacity in certain sectors, in some cases really manifesting itself in unfair trade practices, and that is reflected in the growing number of trade defense measures that the EU has had to start against a number of countries for anti-dumping and other activities. And while leakage leakage and production and investment relocation is a complex phenomenon that's due to a number of different factors. There's no question about that. We acknowledge that clearly in the report. We also argue that this changed landscape makes it all the more pressing, let's say, makes it all the more sensitive to changes in carbon pricing and the stringency of climate policy. It is simply already a much more tense, let's say, backdrop against which changes in climate policy now will also affect how European industry competes in global marketplaces. Next slide, please, Derek. In a majority of sectors, such as chemicals, non-ferrous metals like aluminum, pulp and paper, we identified what Aaron already mentioned, very complex downstream value chains. And especially in those value chains where the downstream semi-finished or finished products have a high percentage of the carbon-intensive raw material as inputs, setting the threshold of inclusion in the CBAM will have huge implications for whether or not we'll see import substitution further downstream. So that's going to be a really important question. Also, in a majority of sectors, we have seen, or we were able to observe, that exports are quite a significant part of the business of European industry. And that makes it understandable that there's been a lot of concern about what happens with exports if indeed a CBAM were to replace the current safeguards against leakage, but there is no particular measure to protect exports against competition and thus against leakage, since we were also able to observe that many European industries on average tend to be less carbon intensive than the average production, global production. So if European producers lose market share in global markets, this will ultimately also result in an increase of emissions globally, everything else being equal. Finally, sectors with high electricity intensity, and Aaron already hinted at that, especially thinking of non-ferrous metals, but also chemicals, pulp, paper, electric arc furnace, steel making, for instance, they are not only affected, of course, by the carbon costs on direct emissions, which in some cases is quite negligible, but especially the carbon cost on indirect emissions, meaning on the electricity that they purchase. And because of the way of marginal price setting in the electricity market in Europe, this pass-through of carbon costs even affects those producers that have virtually zero carbon electricity, say an aluminum plant using electricity from a hydropower plant. They still have a pass-through of some of the carbon costs from the producer on the margin in that power pool, in that power grid, which is typically a gas-fired or a coal-fired power plant currently still. This will, of course, change over time. Next slide, thank you. Across some sectors, we were able to observe that there is a global reference price, or sort of a transparent pricing system, especially in metals, where the London Metals Exchange pretty much sets the reference price globally, which then is also the basis for any transactions. But you also see that, for instance, in petroleum products, where there's regional hubs that set reference prices. And it's very, very hard then for producers to depart from that. They cannot absorb, because that is the price that they compete with globally. So they're price takers effectively. that increases some of the competitive problems that can result from carbon pricing. In some sectors, we also observed that introduction of a CBAM will then introduce carbon cost, or will pass it through to downstream producers, which can then also mean that the downstream producers will potentially experience competitiveness impacts. That goes back somewhat to what I mentioned earlier. Where is the threshold of inclusion of coverage in a CBAM? Because you also have to think about what happens downstream. And finally, what we observed, especially in sectors like steel, aluminum, and fuels, is that European production has been largely privatized in the last decades. There's very few still state-owned or only partly state-owned enterprises, but that's not the case abroad. And again, in some countries, I hinted at that earlier, there really is also strategic financial government support that has contributed to this rapid ramp up in production capacities, resulting in significant excess production in some cases, and also prompting an increase in trade defense proceedings before a number of fora. Next slide, please. Also across several sectors, we were able to observe that the risk of resource shuffling, I think Aaron already addressed that, is real. I'll give one example. While aluminium production in China has on average a significantly higher carbon footprint than European production, all of the imports to Europe, which have increased significantly in recent years, could be covered by plants that have zero carbon electricity in one province. And that tells you how it would be possible for Chinese production just to shift which producers supply the European market, thereby avoiding some of the CBAM burden that would be otherwise hitting Chinese production if it were the average carbon intensity. Finally, many products compete closely of the products from the sectors we're talking about. Say, for instance, metals, paper, plastics, all compete and are substitutes in packaging. And so if one includes some in a CBAM, but does not include others, there may be artificial, not environmentally justified, but just artificial substitution effects simply due to the fact that some have been included and some have not. That's something to also keep an eye out carefully when defining the scope of the CBAM. Similarly, refined fuels can compete with electricity, and there's complex interactions there, especially if indirect emissions, scope 2 emissions, are not covered. Let's go to the next slide, please. And finally, as I mentioned, there are some observations which are really specific to individual sectors, and Andre will mention one of our takeaways is that potentially a CBAM design cannot be equal for all sectors, but he'll get to that in a moment. So for instance, determining the emissions intensive fuels has been really challenging methodologically. There's a great heterogeneity of products and production processes, even within Europe. It'll be similarly problematic, probably more pronounced, even if one were to include this sector, to have a robust methodology to determine emissions intensity. Electricity imports, that's also a somewhat specific specific scenario here, because electricity, of course, is grid bound. This affects particularly direct neighbors of the EU along the east and southern border. But there has been growth in imports from neighboring countries. Much of that electricity is more carbon intensive, and in many cases, significantly more carbon intensive coal-fired electricity. And it's expected to continue growing as interconnection capacities grow. Demand continues to grow in the EU, especially if the EU electrifies as a pathway to decarbonization, and cost differentials across the border continue prompting these kinds of transactions or transfers. And finally, with ferrous and to a less extent non-ferrous metals, there are different production processes, fundamentally different production processes between the primary or virgin metal and then secondary smelting of recycled metals. And because secondaries to just using recycled aluminum, for instance, will not be able to meet demand, and in the case of steel, some uses you have to use primary steel. You can't simply say, well, then we should focus on recycled steel and take that as sort of the desirable production method and use that as the benchmark. There will probably have to be a reflection of the different production processes in a CBAM to again avoid penalizing one over the other. With that, I'll hand it over to Andre. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. It's all been said, but not by me, said Mark Twain, and I'll I'll quote that. But I think that the important part is the fact that a couple of things we didn't mention at the very beginning. One of them is that really this report, because this is raised in some comments we received, we don't really discuss the issue of carbon leakage, whether it's real or not. I think this is, we take it for granted that there is a desire to put in place a border carbon adjustment, and there's got to be a reason for that. So we don't get in that debate. All the other thing is we recognize in this report the fact that competitiveness is the flip coin of from carbon leakage, and that we recognize that competitiveness is based more on more than cost. This recognized, but we are dealing here with carbon cost. The other thing that we also struggled was very much with the fact that this report has been more complex than maybe some of us had anticipated initially. The data availability has not been easy. We have benefited from cooperation from the sectors involved, and to the degree that we could, we double checked those numbers, as well as having to go into some very serious research and data mining on our own. We struggle with in putting this together, even though it was not the primary objective of this report, looking at the objective of a CBAM, because that is not independent of this whole analysis, and whether there were to get other countries to do what the EU does in terms of ambition, to get to that level, to raise the level of ambition in the EU, so that allows us to go to 55%. The level of the leveling the playing field, is this an attempt to a tool to level the playing field, or this is also a way of that some would like to see as eliminating free allocation? I mean, these are very legitimate things in how you look at this. Now, in terms of conclusions, we do know that this is necessary, not because today we haven't been able to address carbon leakage in most cases because of a set of circumstances, sometimes unfortunate, but also the effectiveness of free allocation. However, we anticipate that in the future this may not be the case, and even though it's not for today, it is for the near future, and that we do need predictability. So people know that this is free allocation is not going to be around forever. How do we deal with this how do we deal with this at some point? That this debate and the way of addressing it will have to start now. As Michael said, competition for commodities has considerably become more aggressive, and the world is changed. We're not in the world of €5 a ton of EUAs, we're in the world of 41 euros a ton, going up and up and up. Now, that there will be a need for this significant level of investment as we make this transition. And that is important to have this measures put in place, because we want, I think the target that we all have is that of a decarbonized but not industrialized Europe. There are a number of specific challenges that we see. One of them is the fact that we see that there are the different sectors, the characteristics of the different sectors sometimes militate for different choices to be made in the design of CBAM. You could almost conclude that you need different CBAMs. The beauty of the ETS and the beauty of the accompanying tool should be one tool. So do you, even though you look at different approaches, is this a realistic way to do it? The complexity that you would have in having different CBAM to administer, but also put in place, is something that maybe we don't want to envisage. The fact that exports is something that needs to be seriously considered, because we're not competing internally, we're also competing externally, and the current CBAM doesn't do much the way people are envisaging it for imports only. So it's something that needs to be considered, whether it's part of the CBAM or another tool, but needs to be considered. The challenge of deciding where the sectoral value chains coverage should stop. The fact that we have sectors, we want to electrify. And this is, I'm an electrician, this is music to my ears. I grew up in a period of 6 to 8% growth in electricity loads, and then it stopped. And now we're back into the nirvana of electricians, where the loads and the electrification continues at a very rapid pace. But there are the high indirect carbon costs that are still ongoing, at least for a period. How do you deal with these? It's not going to be forever, but before we get there, we have to deal with them. And there are sectors that are strongly electric right now. They will not be dealing. The CBAM cannot deal with that. Frankly, it is an issue that has not been cracked yet at this point. The long and complex downstreams that also militate looking at CBAM that cover both downstream producers and may include some scope 3 emissions is something that hasn't been considered so far, but something that I think we have to consider. The fact that we haven't tried this machine yet. We hadn't tried the ETS, and we hadn't tried, and we went through a pilot phase. 2005, 2007 we tried this one. The same thing may be necessary to be considered in the case of the CBAM, some kind of a pilot with limited sectoral participation, and maybe more upstream, a more simple type products that are covered also informed by the potential for substitution across the candidate sectors. Last but not least, which is really something that I've kind of caught fire a couple of days ago, what Ms. Carlsbro mentioned, is the debate and the own initiative, what caught the attention of the newspapers, that discussion of the overlap. How do you deal with the current ways of addressing carbon leakage, and how do you transit, or how these two relate? How does CBAM relate to free allocation? And I think the fundamental, what we can agree without letting the cat, the cat out of the bag out of a future report, we all have to agree to the fact that the fundamental principle, you cannot have double coverage. There's no doubt about that. You cannot have double coverage. That is not sustainable. We cannot support it morally. And I think nobody wants that. Nobody asks for that. I think that we have to make a decision whether we want this to replace free allocation. I mean, to be blunt, to call a spade. We do all without free allocation. We auction the heck out of everybody in Europe, and we charge everybody at the border. The alternative is that you maintain free allocation and you charge at the border the delta above the benchmark. Now, these are two possible options. There's a political decision somewhere, or there's a sliding scale of some sort that takes you from A to B. But this is a very serious issue. It's a political issue. In the end, the political decision cannot be escaped. And it's something that is going to torment the three of us as we go into the next slide. And the next slide, Derek, if I can go to the next slide, please, is that we will be launching a report on a BCA proposal. Now, as you have seen, and I mentioned to the panelists before this, we're three friends and people that have worked with each other, Aaron, Michael, and I, for a long time, and we have been hand in hand and work hard. This is maybe the last time, because as we propose the next report, where we actually will have to come with recommendation, it probably may not be a garden of roses, a bed of roses, because we will have different opinions, and this is going to be difficult. But the BCA proposal we will make, we will then have the impact assessment and the proposal for the Commission, and we will at that point have a global town hall that will examine this, and we will produce a critique of that report. And last but not least, in the second half of 2021, we will produce a framework, and that framework will put the CBAM or adjustment or the competitiveness issue in context of adjustment at the border, how it relates to the ETS, how it relates to contracts for difference, how it relates to consumption charges, is going to have to be put in a broader why, because we believe they're interrelated, and we believe that the decision should be made in a rational way between all three of them. I will stop here and thank my colleagues for what has been a very satisfactory and stimulating work that we've done over the last number of months. Now, what I will ask you is to also prepare yourself for the roundtable discussion. But before we do this, we have a number of people that we have invited to comment on this report. Jakob Hansen, the head of Fertilizers Europe. Thank you very much, Jacob, for joining us. Nia Lawler for DG Trade. Susanne Droge, I mentioned her before. She's probably one of the better known people in this business. Joachim Hein, head of climate at BDI, the German Business Federation. I think they have opinions on this. And last but not least, I also recall Richard Baron from the European Climate Foundation, where he had the work on the border carbon adjustment discussion, as well as his pedigree from the OECD and the IEA. We'll start with Jacob. Jacob, your views, your takeaways for report. Was there something you really thought was awful? I hope that that's a very dangerous question. And anything that you would like us to carry into the next report, because this is where the rubber hits the road.
Yes, I think I would like to comment on the report first, and then I will give you something to torment you, so you work harder over the summer here. So let me do that. And first of all, Andre, I want to give credit to you and the roundtable for the work you've done on the CBAM. I think you are probably the ones who most seriously have tried to work the issue and gone beyond just headlines and really tried to look at what it is. And this is also why I comment you on this report. I want to say I agree with your starting point, that there is an asymmetry, as you call it, in climate ambitions around the world. And I think it's clear and obvious that the EU needs also to look into what happens for its own industry. It cannot just give up on industries and lose jobs while continuing to import more and more dirty products from around the world. So I think the days of being naive has to be over. And that's why also I agree with your report, we have to focus on carbon leakage, and especially for in energy intensive industries like my own. So that's a comment. Then on the CBAM itself, I can't help mentioning that for you with the way you finished it. I think it's important to say that for me, CBAM has to have two elements. The first is that there should be a climate effect. It should be something that encourages third countries to do more in terms of climate. And secondly, for me, the CBAM in itself is not an excuse to reduce free allowances or the present way of preventing carbon leakage. And maybe I'll come back to that, Andre, but this is probably where I feel most strongly you need to do more work in the days to come, that you need to think more about how can you combine a CBAM model with free allowances. So coming back to your report, what I really like is that you try to look deeply into the sectors, and I really do think that is necessary in order first to figure out what kind of a model could you work with. So if what we need as an industry is we first of all need some kind of long-term horizon perspective on things we're doing. Because the reality is we're being asked to invest hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of euros. So whatever you do, we need to look at giving a framework that will last for years. And for us in the fertilizer sector, I agree with your conclusions there that the fertilizer sector has a relatively simple downstream sector. So in some, we need to have a few more products than just the base products covered, but it's relatively simple compared to, for instance, chemicals and other products. I agree with that. The only thing we also need to think about is the competitiveness of our clients, the farmers, right? So you cannot just increase the cost of the buyers. You need also to think about the clients because they need to stay competitive as well. And we are also a sector, as in your report, and I completely agree with that, with a substantial export. So if you just load costs onto your products, how can you continue to be competitive in the export market? This is something that needs to be solved as well. And this is a bit where your report stops, and I know you want to look at it, at the issue more later and look at what the Commission is saying. But let me just tell you, I imagine that we could create a model which basically builds on ETS system and the benchmark used there, where then the imports, if they are not if they are more dirty than the benchmarks, they will have to contribute a carbon premium, just like the rest of the EU industry has. If they are not below the benchmark, they will have to contribute. And I think with this one, with this approach, you could also say that free allowances could continue and should continue, and it's logical that they continue, because you're not really giving carbon protection, you're giving importers an incentive to behave better. The actual carbon leakage protection still stays with the free allowances. So I'm looking for a model that combines these two elements. And I think the reason is very simple. We need to stay competitive as an industry. We need to look out for the interest of the farming community to keep their prices at a level where they can compete with farmers in other parts of the world. And also, we need to continue to export. So it's also a question of how do you stay competitive on the world market. So I want to say to you two things. I think we cannot overload the CBAM concept. It cannot solve everything. I think it can give incentive for importers to become more green, but I don't think it can on its own and alone also solve the carbon leakage issue. And this is why I want to say to you, when you look in the next few months on how to design a model, I hope you will keep in your thoughts that we should keep a model that mirrors the ETS and keeps the free allowances, because that is what gives us the security, the long-term perspective to invest as an industry, because we know we want to invest, we want to go green, but it needs to be possible to do it. So thank you very much, Andre.
Thank you, Jacob. Just to make it clear to everybody, I think that I need to reiterate, this is some of the issues that you mentioned, Jacob, as something. That's why I said we're three friends, like the trident of Barcelona, but they all split. And we may split after the next report because we may not agree and we may have a difficulty reaching an agreement, but we fully recognize that these issues that are going to have to be addressed in this report. It was not at the whole intention of this report to do that, but thank you very much. And anyway, we hope that you will be similarly positive after the next report.
Andre, I hope it was clear enough. I'm very happy with the report because I do think we cannot discuss CBAMs without having a clear sectoral view. And this is what I think you have showed with your report, and I recognize that.
That was very much the intention. Thanks for that. Neil, you are from DG Trade. We have dealt with also the trident with DG Taxud, DG Klima, DG Trade. So we're here listening to DG Trade. Go ahead, please.
Thanks, Andre. Just to start, most people call me Niall, but you're actually right. It's perfectly right. It's Neil. So you're probably 1 in a million, Andre. I personally have been following this for 2 years, and I've also followed all of your town hall, well, except for 2. You had 12 town hall events late last year, and they were very extremely useful to gathering what different countries around the world are actually thinking. So we've been following your events, not just from an intra-EU perspective, but also for bringing people together from abroad. So thank you very much for that, and also for the invitation today. Just before I comment on the report, just to give people who are attending some background. So obviously back in December 2019, the European Green Deal communication, we said selected sectors. The roadmap that followed the following March in 2020 said sector choice would be very important, and we'd have a deep contractor study to look at that. Followed by a public consultation where there was a question on this, on the sectors, and essentially there was 609 responses, and so people who had picked sector more than 50 times were, yes, electricity, cement, iron and steel, chemicals and fertilizers. Those were the top 4 that people had picked for whatever reason. The impact assessment internally started in September. Will be finished soon, and it will be published with the adopted proposal expected in June. So we're almost at the end of the process. So this is it's still early enough to feed into the process, but we're almost there. It will be very interesting to read what you say in April. And I could see that you've taken a lot of the analysis, the excellent analysis you've done in October, and applied it a little bit here, and I guess you're going to apply it more in April. So looking forward to reading that. In terms of the actual report, you mentioned that the challenges of carbon leakage, CBAM, may require not just one tool, but several tools in several places. The first thing that we have to keep saying is that it's a climate measure, not a competitiveness measure. This is something that's quite important. So, but it's obviously in different people's reports, they mix the two issues. Also, some of the other colleagues have said that it is part of a much broader Fit for 55 package. We've got 13 different pieces of legislation there. So it's not the only piece of legislation that's coming. And when you do your town hall, your global town hall in July, you will have the benefit of having these 13 pieces of legislation and being able to compare them because coherence is challenging. The report itself, page 71, like your previous report in October, really, the table on page 71 really synthesizes very, very well the issues. So you've taken a number of heterogeneous sectors, but common challenges. And it's, by looking at high, low, medium, I think it is very good. I think I would have liked to have gone into a little bit more depth there, but it's still very, very useful. From our perspective, from the sector choices, obviously, the process is still ongoing. We're still doing the impact assessment, but what it can say is, well, you probably know it already, that it is selected sectors. It is, the focus has been on basic materials. The choice is obviously those sectors that are covered by the ETS. That's probably obvious to you, but I don't know if that's obvious to everybody listening. Cement, electricity, steel have been received an awful lot of attention from commentators from the outset as potential pilot sectors, but we have to stress that the work is ongoing and no decisions have been made. The selection assessment that has been examined is impartial, and of course you'd have to take into effect, obviously, the size of emissions of a sector, the exposure to carbon leakage, but also the sector complexity and administrative effort involved. Now, I think in terms of your table on page 71, I think you cover that particularly well in talking about reference prices, data needs, and then that obviously conflicts with you're not just talking about horizontal sector choice, but also vertical, how far you go down the downstream. So there are trade-offs between the more you go downstream, the more you increase the complexity and administrative effort involved. And then you start going back to whether you go to pilots. So it's kind of like a feedback loop where we're just talking about the sectors, and that's not even getting into things like resource shuffling and other things, which are more of a broader issue than just sectoral choice. So I don't know, that's what I can say on the report. Thank you again, and we look forward to reading the follow-on in April.
Well, Neil, thank you very much. I tell you what, you just made a friend somewhere, because one of us kind of lobbied hard for that table. So you just made a friend. You didn't know that, but I'm sure he's very appreciative, whoever that was. But let me go to Susanne Droge. Susanna?
Yeah, thank you, Andre, and thanks also for the other comments already. We already heard. Well, first of all, I'm impressed by your report, given the short time span you had to produce it. For me, it's really a very helpful update, because when we worked on the EU ETS reform for the third phase, which is more than 10 years ago, we did the same, and it was more or less the same irritating exercise, because our focus was on free allocation and its role in tackling leakage. And exactly, it's not the one-size-fits-all result we hear now for the CBAM. Actually, back then, we also identified only a very, very few, a handful, not even a handful of sectors being qualified for border adjustments. So this update is super helpful now for getting our heads around what the challenge is here. And I think also your conclusions are to the spot. Maybe can just add a few more things. I also, in retrospect, I realized that back 10 years back, we had already the situation that the anticipated relocation of industries will take place anyway, sorry. And that the drivers for this was not the EU carbon price. Of course, the carbon price now will increase and international competition has increased, but still the driving forces behind relocation need clear identification and vary sector by sector. Some, you have mentioned some of them being close to markets is one. Of course, we have the state-owned enterprises with this overcapacity game that is being played, and it's all not news, right? But it needs to be reevaluated now in the light of the discussion of a CBAM. I think a closer look into the design implications from what you found shows again the trade-offs the CBAM will deliver also in the light of other measures at hand. I mean, we heard about the free allocation, we heard about other tools that are discussed, and I think this is actually what we also need here. While from the Commission, TaxUD, we hear we want a one-size-fits-all, at least a legal one-size-fits-all draft or proposal for the EU CBAM. So this squaring of a circle is out there. I'm myself really interested in how that is going to happen. And I feel that a clear agenda for a review of all these exercises is needed once we establish, the lawmakers will establish a CBAM. We don't know whether we will do that, right? It's really in the unknown. Also, what comes to mind, maybe one of my last points, is that a reconsideration of EU tax on carbon in the longer term could play a role here, because passing through along a tax along the value chain could work much better than what we've discussed for the carbon price under an ETS. But that's a rather long run. And as economists say, as I'm an economist, in the long run, we're all dead. In the long run, maybe the CBAM will be dead. But it should be anyway if it functions, right? If the differences will go down. Last point. It also shows, and that was hinted by you when it comes to the calculation, that without partners, you cannot go it alone, because the calculation of intensities of CO2, they no longer hinge on what we do in the ETS when companies have to calculate their carbon impact, carbon cost impact. Here we're talking about quantities of carbon, of CO2 that are being produced outside the EU, and we don't have the data, or we just have the data for some of the countries. So what's the point? The point is that a calculation of the CBAM at the border is a tricky business. I mean, there are solutions discussed, clearly there are, but I see this also as something that our cooperation could make a lot more sense, and maybe that's the good news of after all, that a CBAM will trigger much more information generation from other partners, from partners of the EU in these sectors that are being involved in the CBAM discussion and that are hit by a CBAM and will be covered when there's an ETS or whatever we will have. I think we will have a notional ETS for those imports. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanne. I also have bragging rights because I should have announced that the audience is over 300 people at this point, or it was just under 300 right now. So there's some bragging rights in that. I think that the importance of the message or the discussion, if there's nobody present, it's much less, and so that's not the case. Joachim Hein.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, I suppose so. Thanks a lot, Andre, and thanks very much for inviting me to this interesting panel. And to weigh in directly, I'm very grateful for this report. and it's clear language, very detailed and a very helpful assessment of possible impact on 8 sectors and a well-considered cross-cutting analysis. The report shows, I'd just like to highlight a few things once more, perhaps, shows the need for differentiation. There is not the CBAM and one size will not fit all. The report shows the urgency of a solution to the increasing carbon leakage problem, with increased climate ambition of countries that do not only pay lip service to the Paris Agreement. And the report also shows clearly that several sectors have quite complex value creation networks. Prefer that to chains, actually, that will lend themselves, if at all, not easily to CBAMs. The report also shows quite vividly, I think, that cutting out the question of how to deal with exports when designing a CBAM will lead to major problems for export-oriented sectors, which are, of course, very important for Germany, as you might know. I do appreciate the thought given to jurisdictions that are major trading partners of the EU, you know, cement, Turkey, chemicals, USA, and so forth. But they do not have an explicit carbon pricing scheme in place. For the time being, I at least fail to see how these countries' climate protection measures could be gauged in a way that allows a fair and acceptable treatment of their imports at the EU borders. In preparing today's intervention, I came across the report of the Haut Conseil pour le Climat of October last year, and it says that France's total carbon footprint, including the imported products, is about 70% higher than its national emissions, and that imported emissions must be reduced. France cannot be perceived as reducing its domestic emissions through increased imports and by placing the burden of mitigation on its trading partners. I think this goes for many member states. In this vein, Corinne Lecuré, la présidente du Haut Conseil, finds that the European Commission's carbon border tax project cannot be the only response to mitigating the impact of these imported CO2 emissions. Le Curé has been quoted with, quote, "The carbon border tax is a trade policy that aims to protect companies in their efforts to decarbonize. It is not in itself a decarbonization policy, but it could have an effect on emissions, an effect that will, however, depend very much on the sectors that will be targeted," unquote. And she assumes that the CBAM could reduce the risk of relocation, but that it is not necessary to decarbonize companies, since many of them have already started their decarbonization policies without this mechanism. Having said this mechanism, we still do not know very much indeed about this mechanism and the comms ideas surrounding it. What is often mentioned is a notional ETS, an as-if ETS, and I do wonder what this is supposed to be in practice. Because for such a system to be WTO compatible, it needs to have a floating cap, i.e. the number of allowances, perhaps they should be named differently. The number of allowances the importers need to buy must not be capped. Importers must have the opportunity to buy as many allowances as they want. Otherwise, this will impede free trade and thus constitute a breach of the WTO rules. That's at least my understanding. I also feel reminded of the situation in 2008, I think it was, when the ETS directive was reviewed. And back then the idea was born to make importers pay, in the sense of subjecting foreign companies to the EU ETS. However, this idea relatively quickly had to be laid to rest again, and even the fancy acronym FAIR, Future Allowance Import Requirement, some might remember, and even this fancy acronym couldn't help this. There is not the CBAM, I repeat that, and that comes out very clearly from the report. And what also comes out very clearly is that the CBAM is not a panacea to cure the woes of a lacking level playing field due to very heterogeneous NDCs. CBAM is not and should not be a means to teach others, as it is sometimes implied in certain statements. It is prone to lead to huge controversies if the countries in the scope of it are not in earnest willing to cooperate. In my personal conviction, this instrument can only work properly if designed well and if in fact co-designed with the major trading partners. This will take some time. Why am I saying this? Because I believe that it is a subterfuge to speak of CBAM as being indispensable for carbon leakage protection. Until 2030, the instrument of reallocation can and should be used. Until 2030, we don't need a CBAM, but we should look at this instrument and be testing it in a pilot phase. It is of course correct to say that the free allocation will not last forever, but we can make it last until 2030. We have now regular benchmark updates and we see coal exit plans in many member states. All this means that we are most probably not too short of allowances that could and should be allocated free of charge, at least during the fourth trading period. In the years to come, CBAM should be tested, I said that, together with a few trading partners that are willing to explore the potential of such a mechanism with clear limits to time and sector coverage. All this should be very transparent and the results should be thoroughly evaluated. The G7 meeting under the UK presidency in June this year is perhaps a good opportunity to broach this subject. It may even be discussed on the fringes of COP26 in Glasgow. And some WTO action also seems to be underway. CBAM has also been mentioned in the context of trade and environmental sustainability structured dialogues and could probably figure also on the agenda of MC12 later in November. As John Kerry has recently pointed out, the EU should by no means go it alone. Perhaps it can be a way forward if the EU very patiently and precisely explains its motives in dedicated fora. One critical remark, however, in this context, I'm not at all sure how well the EU will succeed in explaining to others that making importers pay to generate own resources can be justified on climate protection grounds. So, contrary to often heard catchphrases of the sort, now it's the time for CBAM, I do want to underline the conclusion that also is drawn in the report, that in some cases it may be necessary to resort to perhaps completely different instruments, and that the CBAM instruments need to be approached with extreme caution when moving from exploration to implementation. I do thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Joachim. Richard, I had the pleasure to work with you for many years, and I have a lot of expectations from your intervention. I'm quite anxious to hear what your thinking is.
No pressure.
ECF, no pressure there, but ECF is also an important voice in this environmental climate change debate. So quite anxious to hear your intervention.
Thank you very much, Richard, and take my remark, Andre, I'm sorry, and take my remark as speaking in my own capacity and not representing anyone in particular. Maybe a word on why the report is really important work indeed. I think it is because of the critical role that the EU ages ago has put on carbon pricing as its tool for addressing decarbonization. And even if we should not minimize, and I heard others speak about this, the role of broader innovation policies that must prime the pump for low carbon materials and for alternatives, nonetheless, carbon pricing is there. Moving to full auctioning as a principle of, triggering more incentives down the line, but in a world in which very, very few trade partners are also pricing carbon as a direct bearing on the most carbon intensive sectors that are open to international trade. We heard very eloquently about this, and CBAM is justified just on this ground. But to me, the corollary of this is that the continuation of free allowances would question the need and the feasibility of CBAM. And I'm aware there are very divergences of views for sure. Maybe I can offer a reaction that would be food for thought for work down the line. If you look at this option of what you very adequately labeled free allowances and a CBAM for the delta, if you look at this closer, I think it will take us down the path of very detailed macroeconomic analysis asking where are prices set for different products, what allowances surplus exist and in whose hands, what is the equivalence between the EU allowance price and the actual cost that is paid by specific industries, but maybe by specific companies and on specific products as well. It's all very complex, it's not undoable, but it pushes us down the path of tailor-made solutions and accounting, and it's easy to see then the problems also of discrimination, because every producer in a given sector will be different in terms of the cost that it actually bears, and it raises the question, you know, how do you tax people at the border on the basis of something that is so different from one product to the next inside the EU? So I will let you handle that, if you will, in your next report. But I think there are questions around WTO that the trade experts, which I'm not, should look at in the context of that particular option. But let me come back to the very interesting work that the RCST has produced here and make a few brief observations that it triggered on first coverage, on equivalence of efforts, resource shuffling, exports, and indirect costs. And these are just food for thought. So on the question of coverage, a lesson from the rather aggressive trade policy of the Trump administration and their tariffs on steel and aluminum is that the coverage matters. I think you say so yourselves. The Trump administration went from primary products first and soon had to expand because they realized that there was trade shifting to other semi-finished products. So what products do you include at the outset to avoid importers bypassing the tariff via other products is not just a theoretical question, it's something that has been seen. So to be really looked at carefully. On the question of equivalence of efforts by trading partners, I wanted to stress one point. If an importer can show that its country of origin has put policies in place to bring emissions down to a similar level as the EU sector, if the product is not paying for its remaining emissions, as is the case in the EU, it has an immediate competitive advantage. So it argues for applying CBAM also in such cases. In fact, CBAM looks rather impossible to avoid given the cost that it directly puts on the EU producers and not on anyone else if they don't have a carbon price. But the question is whether the challenging country that has not adopted carbon pricing would make the case that the policy choice is sovereign and that the environmental performance is all that matters in this case. I'm not sure that will be a good faith argument, but I think in WTO this might be brought forward and there's a question of how to handle that. On resource shuffling, the point is well argued in the paper showing how importers can allocate their cleaner products to the EU market, but it could also be considered when it comes to exports and rebates for exports. EU producers will also want to optimize on this basis, reserving their more carbon intensive products to the rest of the world because they'll get a rebate on that if that's applied. So the implication on how carbon should be measured to avoid resource shuffling for imports, i.e. on a national average and not on a plant-specific basis, I think is an important one, and thank you for bringing it up in the report. What you present as coverage of efforts in CBAM, which I read as rebate, I just mentioned, I think the carbon leakage logic is very well presented there as well, but if Europe justifies carbon pricing as the most effective instrument to drive the transition, its logic is also that the increase in the cost of the high carbon goods are there to reduce their demand and trigger substitutions. I know that when you do that on foreign markets, you're losing on market shares, increasing emissions. I understand that. But a rebate would open another avenue for a challenge at the WTO, maybe not entirely in good faith, but still. On indirect cost, the report points to the sophistication of electricity pricing as carbon prices find their way in wholesale electricity prices, even though our electricity is being increasingly decarbonized. So it's an interesting thing that we'll need to explain to the rest of the world. It's a complex question around marginal cost pricing. Nonetheless, it really affects indirect costs. So it's a complication because reflecting that true cost and potentially compensating for it or trying to include that in CBAM for imports will go much, much farther than the simple greenhouse gas accounting. And I think in some cases, it touches on the highly sensitive commercial data at the company level. It's very hard to see a technical way out of this. For instance, if you think about aluminum, I remember discussions around sectoral approaches and trying to find out how much aluminum producers actually paid for electricity was impossible. So in passing, you also make some very important points. I'm not going to list them all, but on the current state of competitiveness conditions with the support to state-owned enterprises, for instance, this is not as such a climate policy matter, but in a WTO discussion, I'm sure these elements will certainly come into play and have already with respect to China. So as a general comment, I think the complex picture on a possible CBAM raises the question of what other policies the EU and its partners are putting forward to foster the decarbonization of these sectors, because I would agree with Joachim Hein that this is not the only way we're doing this. And Suzanne, I think, said so as well. But what markets are we creating inside the EU for these new, less carbon-intensive products? Products that will be more expensive, but we collectively agreed to pay the cost. We collectively agreed to go for decarbonization. I think there's good work that the Energy Transition Commission has done to show that this was, in the end, affordable, but we need to create markets for those higher cost products. And the question is whether that can also play a role in minimizing carbon leakage, but that's another discussion. Overall, very much agree with the points made in the conclusion. It is complex. It may be hard to think of a single design that would work across all sectors. And it is not the only tool that's mobilized to foster industrial decarbonization. I think a corollary to this is that a pilot over 2 to 3 sectors may be a sound way forward. And I like the idea that free allowances are going to stay for some time and that we need to look at this progressively. Nonetheless, the issue is there. I had some ideas on areas for future work, but I think they're more along the lines of what needs to do once this is set and put in place. And that would have to be around how does the world agree to monitor this question of carbon leakage with independent systematic statistical analysis, so that some of the arguments that are sometimes made can be either shouldered by decent analysis or in some cases debunked. But that is not something that you're setting out to do with the next reports, which I actually very much look forward to reading. And thank you again for very good analysis here, Andrew.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard, for your comment. Really appreciate it. Now, invite everybody to come on the screen. And if any of you have any comments to make with respect to some of the other things that you heard from the other panelists, now this is the time to make it. I have a couple of people that have raised their hand. And I know there's a couple of more that I'm aware of. So anyone wants to, among the panelists, wants to react first? I'm here kind of the guy that is supposed to direct traffic. I'm going to abstain being a chair from commenting on this, except to say again how much I appreciated working with Michael and Aaron and my colleagues in the RCST in putting this together. I don't see any great desire for people to react strongly. What I wanted, so I have a number of people that have raised their hand. Adolfo Aiello is the first one, so I'll promote Adolfo to panelist, and then Pierre Letourc. So Adolfo, you have the floor, please. Let's try and keep it short so we can have a real conversation.
Thank you, Andre. Yeah, when you accepted me, actually the system collapsed for 20 seconds. So I hope now you can hear me well. A quick comment from the steel sector. I think what you have showed, by the way, in an excellent report, the complexity of a border measure in addressing the carbon leakage risk, in the sense that so far we do have the free allocation and indirect cost compensation. When you try to bring this carbon leakage protection to the border, by definition, you bring the protection measure into the market. And when you do that, you cannot ignore how the market works and what are the characteristics of the market. Even though your measure is purely environmental, it interacts with the market. And I think in your reports, you have highlighted 2 important points for the steel sector. One is the risk of cost absorption, the fact that in steel we have overcapacities, and so importers can easily absorb any CBA. The second one is source shifting that you have already touched. And what you are highlighting with this report, I think, is the need to work very cautiously with this measure, This is not a call for not acting, but it's a call for acting cautiously. And the conclusion I drive for that is, if you do it as a complementary measure with the existing measures, that is certainly the most cautious approach, and it also gives more time for the transition, more time for negotiations, and hopefully a better result in the end. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. So Michiel van Dessel with ExxonMobil. I want to first and foremost thank everyone and your CS teams in particular for another piece of, I think, excellent work in this space. I mean, it's hard to think that you guys continue to improve on the quality of previous things, but this one is really good and spot on, and it highlights the fact that one size doesn't fit all clearly. What I'm gonna I mean, a lot of very good things have been said already. I won't repeat them. I would like to say something which is a bit further out and is not going to be particularly helpful, probably for the near-term discussion, but worth pointing out at least, and it was triggered by what Suzanne was saying. A lot of the complexity that we see is actually driven by the fact that this is all linked to the overarching carbon pricing system, which is ETS, right? And ETS, I think a lot of us will say, will agree, has worked well historically. And free allocation has been a good marriage to ETS. But if we look ahead, then we look at the deep decarbonization ambition, and knowing that what industry needs is investment security, and where ETS in a very kind of deep decarbonized way, you can expect liquidity reduces, volatility increases. And also the fact, as was said by Richard before, that somehow we'll need to find a way to pass on the carbon price signal to the consumer. All of those are reasons why free allocation coupled with ETS may need to be challenged. And so when we think about 2030 plus, are we putting the cart in front of the horse here by trying to make a CBAM work under an ETS context, or should we actually rethink this? It's going to be a huge challenge, of course. I know that, and I won't be making many friends by bringing this up now, but at some point in time, should you consider the concept of a carbon tax, which gives this much better investment security, if you will, which more easily allows to pass to the cost to the market, and which probably makes, if by then the rest of the world hasn't followed the EU's ambition, and the CBAM doesn't need to go, as Susanna said, but still may be there, a lot of the complexities associated with the CBAM would already be overcome by coupling it with a carbon tax, rather than having to couple it with an ETS system. So this by no means is work for the next 6 months. I fully realize that, but 2030 is not that far away, and it would be a shame if we spend the next 5 years optimizing a CBAM design under an ETS, if that is not the right long-term solution. So starting to think about what needs to happen 2030 plus may be very different, and is something that I hope ERCST will continue to play a very prominent role in. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. If you're wondering what Michael is doing right now, he's typing the proposal for this new project. I think that's what he's doing. So you can expect that on your desk very soon. Oliver Sartor.
Thanks, Andre. Yeah, no, really interesting work. I was really happy to see the discussion, I think, of resource shuffling and export rebates, which I think are fundamental to actually being able to implement this, to getting the kind of, I think, political consensus, if not effectiveness of the mechanism. So I think that was really good to focus on that. I also very much agree with the comment I think you made, Andre, on the question of, yes, there are different issues for different sectors, but, I think, this idea that we can somehow have different mechanisms for different sectors, I think it needs to be, treated with a bit of skepticism, in particular because I think, as Aaron said, you can end up charging different carbon prices to different sectors, and you can end up with really bad distortionary effects, which I think would create enormous problems. And so I think that, while some of the industrial associations are saying we should have different systems, well, be careful, because another association will come back and they'll be hurt by the system that you want carved out for you. So the solution might need to be finding the common denominator for everybody. And then finally, I think I want to push back a bit on this idea that, that we can continue free allocation indefinitely, together with the CBAM. I think, you know, it's fair enough to say that we should have a transitional period, as Adolfo said, you know, for security, but also you know, to allow companies to adjust pricing along the value chain over the first few years and so on. But, you know, fundamentally at the WTO, we're going to need to argue that we don't have an alternative to a carbon border adjustment to tackle carbon leakage. That's fundamentally what it comes down to. So if you're putting in place a carbon border adjustment on top of perpetual free allocation, effectively, you are undermining your case at the WTO. So I actually feel like in the Parliament, you know, industry has shot itself in the foot with what it's just supported. Sorry, I didn't mean to be too controversial, Andre, but there you go.
Well, I don't think you know, I'm not in the Parliament, so that's okay. Look, I think that the need for differentiation is an interesting one. I think that we started. Look, I come, and I think many of my you know, Michael and Aaron also kind of wander around North America. So we all come a little bit from the SO2 market. This is kind of, we cut our teeth a little bit into it, or we first learned of this concept and it was bloody simple. Now, you know, when we started the ETS, we thought it was going to be simple, and now it's bigger than the textbook probably. So it's not because when it comes to ETS, I assume I'm above suspicion like Caesar's wife, right? I start by that assumption. But nevertheless, we do discover the complexities. And the same way that people are resisting a different ETS for different sectors, I think there's the expectation that that resistance is going to be put in place. Now, on the other hand, there is a compelling case that sectors are very different. There is a compelling case for that. So how are we, you know, how Michael and I and Aaron, I mean, I don't know about the Commission, how we going to square the circle? I don't know, but we'll find out in the next episode. Now, any reaction? Jacob, I think you have your hand up, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Andre. This is what I said earlier, that I want to help torment you a little bit, I should say, with your next project, because I think one of the difficulties in this discussion is we're not exactly clear what CBAM model we're talking about, because we could be talking about different models in this discussion, and that also then affects on what we conclude from this. So I actually do think in order to get more in-depth discussion and really combine with the specific of the sectors, we need to say we're talking about this model, which will have this effect on this specific sector. So I can only encourage you to follow up and do this work. And I just want to make one more comment. I strongly believe in an open world, trading together, a multilateral system. But sometimes when you hear this discussion, WTO also becomes a stumbling block. Everyone is referring to WTO, we can't move. And my feeling is that in Europe, we have decided we want to move with the green transition. And that means we need to do something, because in Europe has to stop being naive. You know, we have to look out of our own jobs, our own production, our own societies as well. So if we want to move, we have to invent new things that can help us and not be naive, not ruining international cooperation, not ruining international trade, not ruining WTO. But I do think we have to be a little bit open to push against some of the corners to try to move ahead. And I am very concerned about two things. One is in EU, the whole Green Deal is asking industry to make huge investments. And therefore, there needs to be something that is a bit more long-term, and you can start saying this is what is going to be the rules going forward. And this is also, for me, a reason to be a little bit cautious as to just give up free allowances or other elements we have, because we need to make sure that the industry can go along with this. And this is my key message. So this is really, for me, these kind of discussions needs to continue, Andrew, and we probably need to go even deeper to combine the actual CBAM design with the sectors to see what works.
Thank you. We know we have a challenge ahead of us. We're fully aware. Michael, you heard something about WTO. I think I know maybe things about others more than you, but probably you know more than you, Susanna, Aaron. Maybe you guys know more than me about WTO. But in general, you're a lawyer, and I go to a lawyer. I don't ask him what the problems are. I ask him to find the solution. That's kind of the print. My son is a lawyer, and he answers me that is a problem. So that doesn't solve anything. So Michael, what do you think?
Well, there were many points on WTO. Richard mentioned a few. Aaron and I, we've had many conversations even before this project, Susanna and others. And it is, I think, as you say, there's a world of sort of theory. This would be safe in a theoretical, this is how you would do it by the letter to avoid any kinds of risks. The CBAM will not allow us to go that path. That's pretty clear. And that's when you enter the political world of real realpolitik, really, and the power behind, and the influence and the momentum behind the actors who are pushing something, or pushing a certain initiative. Will it be challenged or not? If there's no challenger, if there's nobody disputing it, it doesn't really matter. And so I think a lot depends on the geopolitics of this. We haven't talked so much about it here, although it was brought up. We do touch upon it in the report. Which countries would be affected if different sectors are included? Are we talking about China? Are we talking about the US? Or is it more the immediate European neighborhood? That will have significant implications, I think, for ultimately whether or not the WTO makes a huge difference, or is rather sort of one of many more technical issues. And of course, I think, somebody mentioned the G7 as a potential forum. What's happening in the United States? There's been a lot of recent developments on that. The US Trade Representative mentioning BCAs again in the trade policy agenda for 2021. And yet John Kerry cautioning the EU against moving too fast, probably because the US is simply not there to start thinking about a design and thinking about how one could even cooperate. They need more time. So I can't offer a good, clear answer on, this is how we do it with the WTO. There's too many moving pieces. But ultimately, I think if there's enough momentum and big political players, I don't think that it won't die in Geneva in the Centre William Rapart. I don't think that's where it would die.
I went to school there. I hope you won't die there. No, I think that it may well be that people. Somebody mentioned COP26. I don't think a lot of people want this to kind of raise its ugly head in UNFCCC negotiation. That would be a pretty ugly scene, I think. Susanne and then Joachim.
Maybe we need to embed this a bit in the timeline we are talking about, and also in the international context. And the timeline is that the EU doesn't plan to start this thing before 2023. And there will be a lot of water under the bridge until then. And also we will see in the second half of this year how member states will have a buy-in. The Germans are heavily pushing for alternatives at the moment. They try to convince that there are alternatives to a CBAM. The French are definitely in favor of it, no matter what. And so I'm just saying that 2023 is a first idea to introduce it. Whether or not it will happen is totally open. So, and this geopolitical situation at the moment, the CBAM just shows what's obviously possible to make trade partners move into a climate cooperative direction. While Kerry, some of you may recall, was one of the few Democrats that voted in the Senate in 2012 to sanction the EU because of the aviation ETS. So he has good reason to be cautious about a CBAM, right? So all this history behind it has also to be kept in mind. But to bring us back to the sectoral thing, I think your report makes a real strong case for testing the ground and thinking thoroughly about those sectors where we know the most about how leakage could happen via trade. And I can only come up with one sector here, right? And that's always the same sector. So how to single it out? That's also a question. We had a reform agenda in 2017. We had an EP debate on taking salmon into a different scheme. We heard all that. So, but it boils down to how this the CBAM can only work in a specific setting. And if that is part of the idea of the CBAM, that it is working against leakage, I think a broader approach is still cannot be cited right now. It needs a test phase, as we did with the ETS, as you've mentioned, Andre. And it was the same noise. We had a lot of noise when the ETS was introduced. Probably people tend to forget about that.
Oh, I think some of us are old enough to remember that. Joachim, and then let's hear what's good for the people. James Collins.
Thanks, Andre. It was I who mentioned the COP26, but I explicitly said on the fringes of COP26, and that might be quite useful if we look at, as I said, at MC12 later in November. But I wanted to make two small points. So first, I haven't been in touch with things relating to WTO until very recently. Since then, I've listened quite a bit to Mr. Wolf, Deputy Director General, and he did impress me. And he was also talking about CBAM in one or the other way. And one statement of his I recall is WTO never stands in the way of environmental protection. It never has stood in the way. So this is what I tried to drive home, really. It is about explaining, and it's about patiently explaining and talking to others, especially to those that I want to have in the scope of such an instrument. And I stand to be corrected, but what I've seen so far is that the EU is not doing this. They are talking about this in very general manner, but not really going into deep dives with trading partners, let alone into co-design or something like that, which I would think very reasonable. The other point, sorry for being slightly long, am I the only one who thinks that this notional ETS is, well, what's the point? I wondered whether I could tempt Neil into a sort of brief remark. What's the point of a notional ETS if there is no cap? Why call it ETS in the first place? If there can't be a cap, at least not in my knowledge. So what's the point of it? Thanks.
This is gonna sound really bad, but the commission before the people.
Well, just, you know, in the roadmap I mentioned to start my intervention, there was three broad options. There was the carbon import tax, the kind of notional ETS or mirror ETS, and then there's an excise tax consumption charge / consumption charge. So there was three broad options on the table. They were slightly broadened in the open public consultation, but essentially three. So that is what's being looked at the moment. So I guess rather than say what's the point, it's more like, well, what do you prefer?
There's your answer, Joachim. You want spinach or you want Brussels sprouts? Let me go to James Collis while Joachim ponders what he prefers. James, tell us what's good, what the CBAM does good for the people.
Thank you, Andre, for the opportunity to ask our question. The work we've done in the States on the BCA supports what a lot of other people have been saying, which is particularly that a sectoral approach to a border carbon adjustment leads to a lot of further complexity. And so I know absolutely that this report is based on a sectoral view. But the question that we would like to ask, because we still see it as a legislative option within the context the EU is currently considering, is how much does an economy-wide carbon price signal simplify some of the complexities around coverage that have been discussed so much in detail? And just very briefly to the point Joachim Heim made earlier about cooperating with other trade partners on the development of policy, our understanding from our colleagues in the States is the US will only do a BCA with export rebates. So we think they would see that as an absolutely core component. Thank you.
Thanks. Peter Bocek.
Thank you, Andre. Hello, everybody. I haven't been able to follow your entire discussion, but what I heard was really excellent. and also thanks for this excellent report. I would just like to point out that the positive thing about CBAM is that we are now really looking at individual sectors and at their issues, and we are looking at imports, we are looking at exports, we are looking at competitiveness effects. And that is all missing to my mind in these previous impact assessments with very general macroeconomic modeling. Now we are really looking at products, at value chains, and at costs, at transport costs, raw material costs, and all the like, and what kind of carbon pricing impact there is. So that is really the first time I find that we are diving deep into the sectoral approach, and that is what we need to pursue further, I believe, to find solutions, especially for sectors that are so far not covered, that are so far not really thought about enough. When I think of the chemical industry, for instance, being extremely export-oriented, having a very complex, long value chain. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Thomas, a very short intervention I'd like to give, but I'd like to go in that kind of final round, starting with Susanne. So Thomas, can you make your point, please?
Yeah, sure. Just very briefly, I just wanted to get back to Oliver's point, because I think it deserves sort of a head-on response. I think if we read the Parliament's resolution, of course, we don't know what the Commission is going to do, how the Commission is going to justify CBAM officially when they make the proposal. But the European Parliament's resolution is extremely, extremely clear that this is a tool to fight the lack of proper responses from third countries. It's very clear. If you read the resolution top to bottom, it is very clear from first paragraph to second to third and so on. It's very clear on this point. I think our problem predominantly is that we all think of CBAM as a carbon leakage instrument. That's what we feel. But if you look at the rhetoric, if you look at how the Parliament's resolution is phrased, it's very clear it's an environmental instrument to tackle the imports. So that's point number one. Point number two, I want to second what Jakob said and Michael as well on the WTO. You know, we are in a situation, well, we all know where the WTO is, so we shouldn't probably worry too much about where it is. But the main problem with the WTO is that the issue of CBAM is not really about double protection. The central WTO problem is whether we can even impose a CBAM on an import because of emissions in a third country. That's the main problem. So whether or not we have double protection or not is not the issue. Third, I'm not going to get into this issue of is it double protection or not, because we've already discussed it numerous times, and one of the options is not double protection. And then the fourth element, which is also very important, free allowances are decreasing. The cap's decreasing. The number of free allowances that each of the sectors is getting is dropping year by year. So in a way, this talk about keeping free allowances forever, it's not the truth of the sectors. We are losing free allowances year to year. Thank you.
Let me go to Susanne, and I'll go to I have the panelists that were here and they took their time, and I'll go to them very quickly, and then with my colleagues, Michael and Aaron at the end. So Susanne, you start first, please.
Yes, thanks a lot. I'm sorry, I have to drop out really punctual. Well, thank you. It was really rich. And I think this deep dive is really important to keep a kind of overview also on what we are talking about when we designing a tool that has not been tested at all yet, which is really a theoretical construction and which is a bit overloaded when it comes to its functions, right? We heard again what the interpretations are. So it is also a tool that can be regarded from so many perspectives that a common ground is not in sight of what is going to happen with it and what the function is, because there is only one. This is the fact. We've heard that today again. So all I'm saying, or all I want to say at the end is keep on the good work. I think we will hear a lot about this in the following months, and I look forward to be part of this discussion again anytime soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susanne. Jacob?
I would like to echo Susanne here and say I have really also enjoyed the discussion. I think it's a very important discussion we're having, because one of the things that Susanna mentioned, which I think is also very clear, is we need to agree on what the CBAM is going to do. Is it protection? Is it an environmental tool that want to push other third countries to do more? I think that's one big question we have. And then, as I said to you before, Andre, there's a lot of work to be done on what concrete model are we talking about, and then combine it with the sectors, because then we can have sort of really, is this a solution or is this not a solution? I just want to underline here again, I think the EU is moving forward in their green agenda, and that means the policy options need to move forward as well. But as has also been said here, we need to do it cautiously in order not to burn ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. Joachim?
Yes, thanks, Andre. Same again. Very, very good to be part of this discussion. Thanks very much. Very, very good discussion. Two major points to recall. The CBAM proposal will be one proposal of 13 or something proposals in June. So it will be of absolute importance to look at the whole picture, at least try to look at the whole picture, complex as it may be. But we haven't even talked about a review of the Energy Taxation Directive, for example, with all these little bits and pieces that interplay, and if you turn something there, something else turns in the far right hand corner. So this will be really, really important. And the second point I'd like to underline once more, I've also seen, I think it was Parliament saying we'll have that in place 2023. I don't see that. I simply cannot see this. And do look at CBAM. Yes, it's the free allocation is finite. It's absolutely clear. I mean, how else can you become climate neutral in 2050? But give it time because of the complexity of the whole stuff. Thanks.
Richard.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much. It's been really, really interesting and dense. I guess regarding the design, the question to me would be, what do you gain by tailoring this too much to this and that sector? Even though I find the analysis that you've done and that table in the back end of the report to be very, very interesting. So finding the right balance on this in terms of feasibility of intersectoral competition and so on will be quite critical if it's not to be challenged even inside the EU. I would echo what some said on the panel on how this opens a frank discussion with trade partners, and maybe it all starts with measurement of carbon. I think there will have to be many, many discussions across the Atlantic and to the East to explain and convince. And I think transparency in that respect is absolutely essential. And that report, that work actually contribute to that. So I wanted to commend you for this, Andre, Aaron, Michael, and everybody else who's worked on this. Thank you.
Neil, the Commission always has the last word.
No, we're keen to listen. I think in your October paper, you answered a hell of a lot of questions, but I think some of these questions are still being discussed. So you answered them, but the questions being raised again. And then some of these questions apply to certain options, but not to other options. So maybe, I don't know, one way is to say, well, you know, different WTO obligations apply to different types of tools, regulations, taxes, different things. So perhaps maybe a more nuanced discussion of WTO might be helpful, because otherwise the same issues come up and over again.
Thank you, Neil. Appreciate it. My colleagues, Aaron and Michael. Michael and Aaron. Who wants to start?
Aaron, who should go first?
Well, we started east to west.
East and west are relatives, so I don't know.
What is it? They're not relative. As far as I know,
that's Michael.
As far as I know, New York State is east of British Columbia. As far as I know.
That's true. Yeah, I think that was a nice statement.
Neil, the questions that won't die, and we haven't killed them yet. They keep coming back. They're becoming zombie questions in some ways. But I think Jacob made a good point. Once we settle for a design, and we'll have a straw man, the commission will come out with a proposal. It makes it a lot easier to start answering very concrete questions. Before you do that, there's many balls in the air, and each time you try to pull one out of the air, something else pops up, as Joachim rightly pointed out. For me, one of the good comments that, I mean, really said, there's a lot of rich insights, a lot of good feedback in the discussion today, but I like particularly this reminder that, yes, so we identified many problems. For instance, the heterogeneity of sectors and how it's really hard to envision a perfect CBAM that can cover all sectors, you know, one size fits all. At the same time, there are equally problems with selecting individual, you know, different CBAMs for different sectors. Oliver made a good point, Richard made a good point. So these will be challenges. For my part, I'm getting my Kevlar vest because it'll be hard debates with Andre and Aaron in the next weeks. Thank you very much, though, for the feedback.
Aaron.
It's been such a rich discussion. You know, in so many places I'd like to jump in, but I'm going to restrict myself to two issues, which for me were interesting and I thought were under touched in our discussions. And so in that sense, it's not a summary as much as thoughts about future direction. One of which is the idea of timing. And Joachim Hein mentioned that he didn't see this thing coming in place by 2023. We know Joachim also mentioned, or maybe Jacob mentioned, we have hundreds of millions of dollars of investment in the covered or candidate sectors waiting to take place, potentially in the EU, potentially elsewhere, or potentially deferred, or potentially into high carbon emitting capital. That if we, you know, it seems to me like there's a disconnect between the timelines. If we think about a 2023 implementation or later of just a pilot phase of a CBAM, and the fact that we're ramping down the cap, we're ramping down free allocation, we're ramping up ambition under the EU Green Deal. This feels like a disconnect to me, and it's something that troubles me. And secondly, the question of how the CBAM would relate to other countries, and I'm thinking here particularly of the United States. The CBAM is not like a border tax adjustment. It's not like a value-added tax that you can take off at one end and put on at the other end. It is, in fact, it's a regulatory instrument. And we're trying to find a regulatory instrument at the border that is equivalent to the regulatory instrument that is the ETS internally in the EU. That's a much more complex task. And in that sense, it offers us the challenge of trying to think about how we design a regulatory instrument that takes into account the regulatory regimes in other countries. And the United States is key among them. We know that the US will not anytime soon have a carbon price. And yet there will be intense political pressure, both from the US and within the EU, to find some solution which takes into account the newly ambitious US administration's position on climate. And to me, this is a challenge, the contours of which I really can't fathom yet, how we're going to work this one out. But I look forward to it.
Thanks. Thank you to all. The thing that I want to emphasize that I think came out of this report, at least what I'm taking from it, after spending quite a few weekends talking to my friends in across the pond, is the diversity that comes across. I mean, this clear diversity, and that diversity translates to complexity. You know, on the other hand, we don't want to produce something the French would call a usine à gaz. And business does need some predictability on the other side. You do need to know you are in 2021, you have this long investment cycles, you need to know what you're investing in, what are the tools that will be there. So that militates very much, at least in our mind at this point, the conclusion that we would take from this is that the need to test the machine. And I think they need to be tested on some sectors that are probably more appropriate, and I hope the regulator will draw their conclusions on what are the most appropriate ones from, and we hope that the work that we've done will be will help in making those choices. Now, the important thing at the end of the day is that we will continue to live, unless Mr. Timmermans is right, and we will all be friends, and there wouldn't be no need for a adjustment at the border. There would be need for something, because the world would still have asymmetrical climate change policy. And I believe that we will continue to have that. I think that CBAM needs to be tested, if it is the real McCoy or there's something else. And we need to test a number of approaches, maybe from now until really free allocation is not an option anymore. And there's no need to speed up something unless we to introduce something new while we still road testing the machine. But really what I want to talk about is the fact that we are now heading into another month, because the report, the next report, the one that Michael talks about, the Kevlar, is due in April 22nd or so, we think, as a date. One thing that somebody reminded me on the chat, on the private chat, is that even though Neymar, Les Messi and Suarez have split, they still remain friends. So I hope that after this experience we'll still remain friends, and I'm sure we will. And also to remind those of you that's still here, about 190 of you, that there's an exceptionally interesting French event that I think the Frédéric Branger has mentioned, and Laurent Michel. So I think, Michael, you're part of that, if I'm not wrong. So I urge you to look at that. And the presentation, the video, and the report are available on the ERCST website. Again, thank you very much to the presenters. Thank you very much to the sponsor. As they say on PBS, this would not have been possible without contributions from, and all the sponsors are listed on the report. And we shall see you in April sometime. Until then, I hope you have a nice weekend, whatever that may be. So thank you very much, all.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you very much.